All right, well, hello everyone. It's so good to see you all again. I'm tuning in from my home here in Shipuktuk, Halifax, which is the unceded territory of my ancestors, the Mi'kmaq. This land continues to be the home of the Mi'kmaq and has been for over 10,500 years. And as such, it's crucial that we acknowledge and pay respect to the elders and the stewards of this land, both past and present. So this land is governed by the treaties of peace and friendship, which are recognized and affirmed by the Canadian Constitution. And kind of like Emily, I would ask you to reflect upon the land you're on, past stewards, present, as well as potential future stewards. So as you can see, my SGSAH project is entitled TransAtlantic Fluidities, Lochs, and Bogs. It's part of my ongoing research that applies Indigenous approaches to mapping littoral spaces across Gothic landscapes. This portion of my research set out to respond to kind of the overarching SGSAH Earth Scholarships Program. The aim of that, which was namely to intervene in and address the climate emergency by engaging in what SGSAH calls new approaches to addressing the global challenge of climate crises. However, I do want to point out that the approaches I draw on, such as Netagulink and other traditional Indigenous ecological knowledge, is not new per se, because these ways have always been tied to the land. What is new is the increasingly formal recognition of traditional Indigenous ecological knowledge as valid and scientific, and placing it in conversation with other research epistemologies on an international scale, which is exactly what we did as a group in Scotland. So my research actually came to a pinnacle here, where I went hunting for the Loch Ness Monster. Well, kinda. I went hunting for stories of the Ayakushka, better known as the Loch Ness Monster, Nessie, the water horse, or the Kelpie, with the goal of understanding how folkloric figures that are born from particular places embody shifting cultural anxieties about the environment. And specifically, I focused on waterways. So ultimately, this research is rooted, so to speak, in the idea that climate change has always been, albeit in the contemporary sense, functioning at a rate that the human species has not previously witnessed and cannot seem to adequately adapt, and thus resulting in higher rates of ecophobia and climate change anxiety. So I argue that we don't fear climate change so much as we fear the climate changing. And what I mean by this is that we have constructed, through colonial binary thinking, the land as a fixed and stable space set in opposition to the water as a fluid and unstable space. Indigenous thinking, though, in contrast, dispels this idea of a binary between the two. But our inability to control, or according to some discourses, manage the land as a place of unchanging stability results in a resistance to acknowledging and developing ongoing solutions to climate change. And so what we do is we tend to displace these anxieties resulting from a lack of anthropocentric superiority and control over the environment onto the land itself. And in our stories, this often manifests in a body of a monster, or what Jack Halberstam eloquently calls the scraps of abject humanity. According to Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, the monster's body is a cultural body. It is an embodiment of a certain cultural moment, of a time, a feeling, and a place. And through said embodiment, the monster answers Halberstam's question regarding who must be removed from the community at large. And this is what happened to the Ayakushka of Loch Ness. Oops, sorry. There you go. In such horror films as Beneath Loch Ness Terror, and the Loch Ness Horror. In turning the Ayakushka into a monster and thus justifying our hunting of it, we seek to rid the Scottish landscape of a repressed past as well as a future changingness, and through that recover some mythological form of environmental stability. So as I hunted for stories of the Ayakushka, though, my attentions were ultimately drawn toward a different figure that we might also call Gothic and in some cases potentially monstrous. She is an embodiment of the land as well as the water and all the spaces in between the two. And even as she inspires fear, she ultimately dismantles these mythical ideas of environmental stability. And I am, of course, talking about the kayak. She has many names, such as hag, witch, goddess, veiled one, and queen. And there are many, many versions of her story. Sarita Desta and David Rankine trace the oldest stories back to the 5th century BCE along the Iberian Peninsula of Spain, first in the histories from the writings of the historian Herodotus, who chronicled some Celtic oral tales, and then later those of Strabo and Pliny. So these stories ultimately migrated with the Celts into Ireland and then up into Scotland and the Isle of Man, changing as they went from place to place. So Desta and Rankine argue that more than any other figure in Celtic or British myth, the kayak represents the cumulative power of time. And one such reason is that over the 2,000 years that we have her stories, we're still telling those stories, but also because she's often represented as a crone figure that is associated with winter and time. The manner in which she traverses time collapses past, present, and future, so that the present is never held hostage at the expense of the past or the future. She is also often called the mother of the herd for her affiliation with deer, which she is tasked with protecting. And finally, she is a mover of the earth. In many stories, she forms mountains and shapes the Scottish and Irish landscapes. So the kayak is abundant across Scotland, and while there are many stories about her, I want to focus specifically on 2 versions, and these are tied to the places that I visited during my time in Scotland. The first is familiar to most of you. That was told to us by Michael Given during our time in Glasgow, and this is the Hag of the Bog. So in this version, she is an extension of the interstitial space that is the bog. She follows those who traverse the bog and attempts to steal the cap off their head. If she succeeds, she rubs the cap between her palms, resulting in the cap's owner growing weak and weary. And eventually, when she rubs the cap into nothingness, its owner collapses dead in the bog. In theorizing bog Gothic, Derek Gladwin refers to bogs as marginalized landscapes, untamed wastelands that resist incorporation into modernity and colonialism. Consequently, he states, the bog Gothic draws on, synthesizes, and expands the natural history of bogs and their enigmatic fusion between human and non-human elements. So when read in this context, the kayak represents a connection between humans and their non-human neighbors who inhabit the bog. She is simultaneously static and fluid to reflect that space, and she marks a resistance to colonialism, its modernities, and Western conceptions of progress. After all, the bog itself resists development. So the kayak seems to be dangerous, Gothic, dare I say, a monster of Glencoe. Yet one must only fear her under 2 conditions. Now, the first is, of course, if you go into a bog wearing a hat. But more importantly, the second is if one is disconnected from the land itself. So, for example, one's demise at the hand of the Hag of the Bog is a slow embodied process that only occurs when the victim is not paying attention to their bodily relationship to the bog space. In resisting this entanglement, the victim, ironically, becomes part of the bog when they finally collapse into it. So the kayak gives the bog a kind of agency and forces the trespasser to either entangle themselves willingly with this space or to succumb to it. The body, in its final demise, intervenes in the mythical distinctions between the fluid and the static, as the bog is neither land nor waterway. Now, the second story I want to talk about chronicles how Loch Ness itself was formed. Now, in nearby Inverness, the kayak had 2 wells, which she would open every morning and cap every night. One day, the kayak left her duties to a maiden named Nessa. But Nessa came too late to cap one of the wells that evening, and as such, the water spilled over. Nessa, fearing this overpouring of water, ran away. But the kayak, witnessing the events from atop a nearby mountain, cursed Nessa for neglecting her duties and transformed her into the River Ness and Loch Ness. In this latter version, the kayak collapses distinctions between water and the body, as Nessa goes from a seeming state of anthropogenic stability to environmental fluidity. Thomas M. Stewart would call this a queer disruption, or transfluidity, whereby the body itself transforms. Stewart claims that Gothic characters exhibiting transfluidity, whether it is of body, time, space, or something else, sit on borders and boundaries, mocking taxonomic and evolutionary discourses. In essence, these bodies disrupt Western and colonial constructs of a species hierarchy and a status quo. Stewart, building on the work of Lee Edelman, goes on to note that these transtemporal transgender entities rupture reproductive futurity, the basic foundation of the contemporary social structure. As such, fluidities are designed to open up the possibility of human extinction narratives by eschewing heteronormative reproductive futurity. In Embracing Extinction, Sarah E. McFarlane tells us that conventional Western narratives are actually salvific operations that suppress the potential of human extinction and demonstrate the recuperation of individual sovereignty and endurance. The white male human individual as a site of survival, with a female character signaling the potential for heteronormative reproductive futurity. But fluidities, such as the story of the kayak and Nessa, allow for other kinds of futurities. In essence, they intervene in the climate emergency by accepting an unstable, a fluid, and a possibility of extinction, all of which are part of accepting the climate itself in a changing state. And here's where I would like to highlight how and why traditional Indigenous ecological knowledge can be beneficial in adding this to this kind of dialectic. A 2019 assessment report created by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services claims that lands managed by Indigenous peoples, tend to be healthier and more vibrant than other areas. Over 1 million species of plants and animals are threatened with extinction, yet Indigenous territories sustain animals, plants, clean air, and fresh waters that are in dangerous decline elsewhere. The reasons noted for this contrast include respectful management, maintaining strong relationships between people and the land, and using traditional knowledge. In the Mi'kmaq context, for instance, our relationships with the land are based on the principles of Nedugulink. Similar to the traditional ways of the Quechua peoples that Charles Pigot shared during our time at Strathclyde, Nedugulink is premised on respect, responsibility, and reciprocity between humans, other than human species, and all non-living things, with the goal of ensuring there will be enough for the next 7 generations. In practice, Nedugulink would dictate that we resist hoarding, over-harvesting the land, and privileging any species, including ourselves, over other species. It is a way of thinking and being that does not privilege past, present, or future. It does not privilege stability, but claims that everything is fluid. It accepts the loss of certain species as part of the cycle, and it proposes an ethics of land stewardship in place of management. So Dan Schilling notes the irony in the fact that it has taken so long for non-Indigenous peoples to consider the spiritual and ecological underpinnings that help define Native peoples' relationships to nature, given that these relationships sustained most tribal nations in the land on which they lived for thousands of years. As I noted earlier, my people have been here for 10,500 years. This is not to state that all Indigenous nations have done so successfully, of course, nor that many did not damage their own lands in the process. Ultimately, it comes down to the idea that Indigenous nations sensed that their existence was linked to the environment's well-being. And while this may sound easy enough, it requires a commitment to developing long-term relationships with the land that are reciprocal and based on allowing the land to change in the manner that it sees fit, rather than the manner that we see fit. J. Baird Callicott believes that our relationship with the environment, above all things, cannot be based on what use the land has for humans. So, in the Scottish context, how might we learn from things that have long held relationships to the land? And this is where I believe stories of the kayak and how they have been altered across time might work. McCarty refers to kayaks as hags who were once goddesses. And this pinpoints how the church's influence in Scotland recast the kayak as malevolent hag and spinner of evil spells. Desta and Rankine argue that her positive qualities have been demonized and she has become twisted into a malevolent or hideous figure of fear, a far cry from the benevolent land-shaping lady of the beasts or priestess guarding the waters and the animals. Desta and Rankine go on to note how the mindset which produced the witch trials emphasized a negative view of solitary women, resulting in the kayak becoming a perfect scapegoat during the witch trials that occurred in Scotland between the 16th and 18th centuries. She has thus transformed many times over the past 2,500 years, And as an embodiment of the environment, the land itself has borne both the benefit and the brunt of said shifting ideologies. And yet, despite the influence of Christianity, the witch trials, and contemporary desires to create a scapegoat for a rising ecophobia, the kayak remains. Of the wealth of Scottish figures we may call Gothic or monstrous, the kayak stands the test of time and evokes the unique materialities and social practices, as Emily Alder might term them, of the Scottish landscape. Tom J. Hillard, speaking of Gothicized representations of nature, argues that eco-critics stand to learn a great deal by looking seriously at the long history of unsettling and horrific depictions of the natural world. While Simon C. Estock asserts that the more we talk about representations of nature, the more it becomes clear that there is a need to talk about the contempt for the natural world in a definable and recognizable discourse, what we may call ecophobia. Hillard's and Estock's calls to action are precisely why I'm contextualizing these tales in the Gothic, despite them not being explicitly discussed as such, and precisely why I believe traditional Indigenous ecological knowledge is necessary. So to conclude, I want to return to this central question, that is, can we leverage the fear produced and embodied by stories of the land, such as the tales of the kayak, as methods for intervening in and addressing the climate emergency? And to answer this, I turn to ideas of naturalistic horror, as well as the words of philosopher and environmentalist Val Plumwood, and her concept of the eye of the crocodile. To be in the eye of the crocodile, or perhaps the ayak or the kayak or the ayakushka, is to be rendered inconsequential in a harsh and predatory universe, where, as Don Keatley states, one goes from the center of the universe to meat, from being the origin of meaning to that which is absolutely meaningless. And perhaps this is exactly what we need to become. Wilaliak, thank you.